everyone and welcome. In this short video, we're focusing on the second element of the tort of negligence, namely breach of the duty of care. Remember, for a successful negligence claim, a claimant must prove three things. Firstly, the defendant owed them a duty of care. Secondly, that the defendant breached that duty. And thirdly and finally, that the breach actually caused the damage that was suffered by the claimant. So once the duty of care is established, the next question is, has that duty been breached? To prove a breach, the claimant must show that the defendant's conduct fell below the appropriate standard of care. The burden of proof is on the claimant because this is a civil case. The standard of proof is on the balance of probabilities. In other words, the court must be satisfied that it's more likely than not that the defendant failed to act as a reasonable person would have. So how do the courts decide whether someone has met the required standard? Well, they apply the reasonable person test. In the older cases, they refer to this as the reasonable man test. This is an objective test, meaning it doesn't depend on what the defendant personally thought was reasonable. It depends on what an ordinary reasonable person would have done. In Hall versus Brooklands Auto Racing Club, Greer, LJ, described the reasonable person as the man on the Clapham omnibus. Later in McFarlane, Lord Steyn modernized the phrase, calling them the traveller on the London Underground. The point is that the law expects everyone to meet an objective common standard of care. A good example is the case of Nettleship versus Weston, where a learner driver injured her instructor. The court held that even a learner driver must meet the standard of competent and experienced driver, so no allowance is made for inexperience. The test remains objective. In deciding breach, the question is partly a matter of law. That means that the court sets the standard, and partly a matter of fact. The judge then decides whether that standard was met in the specific circumstances. So first we set the legal standard, and then we judge the facts against that standard. Sometimes a different standard applies to skilled or professional defendants. For example, in Bolam and Free Hospital Management Company, the court said that a professional is not negligent if they act in accordance with a practice that is accepted as proper by a responsible body of professionals in that field. This became known as the Bolam test. However, in Blytho with the City and Hackney Health Authority, the court added an important qualification, that the professional opinion relied upon must be logically defensible. So, a court may reject expert evidence or expert opinion if it doesn't stand up to logical analysis. Together, these cases show that professionals are judged by the standard of a competent peer group, not by their own personal belief or their own personal subjective standards. For unskilled defendants, like learners or beginners, usually no allowance is made, as we saw in Nettleship versus Weston. But there are a few exceptions. Children, for instance, are judged by the standard of a reasonable child of the same age rather than by an adult standard. In sporting events, the standard is lower. Participants are only negligent if they show a reckless disregard for the safety of others. The law recognizes that risk is sometimes part of the activity itself. Several additional factors help determine whether the defendant's conduct fell below the required standard. So these factors help to set the standard. For instance, foreseeability of harm. If the risk wasn't reasonably foreseeable, there's no breach. For example, in Rowe and the Minister of Health, anesthetic became contaminated due to a risk unknown at the time, and the defendants were not liable. Another factor is the magnitude of the risk. The greater the risk, the higher the standard of care required. In Bolton versus Stone, for example, a cricket ball hit a passerby, but because such accidents were extremely rare, the club was not negligent. Also, the social utility of the activity or the benefit to the society. If the defendant's action had significant social value, the court may be slower to find negligence. Tomlinson, the risk to thrill seekers diving into a lake didn't justify restricting public enjoyment of the lake. Also, we look at the practicality of taking precautions. The court looks at whether reasonable steps could have been taken to prevent harm. The case of Latimer, the factory floor became slippery after flooding. The employer spread sawdust but didn't close the factory. the court held that reasonable precautions had been taken by spreading sawdust. Finally, common practice may be taken into account. So the standard is also informed by what is typical or accepted in that specific context. But common practice is not a complete defense if it happens to be an unsafe common practice. To summarize, breach of duty asks whether the defendant acted as a reasonable person would have in the circumstances. The test is objective, not subjective. For professionals, the BOLA-LIFO principles apply. The court also considers factors such as foreseeability, risk, social utility, practicality, and common practice. Together, these principles help the law balance fairness to defendants with protection for claimants, so ensuring that liability only arises where conduct truly falls below the reasonable standard. And this is the second element in a negligence claim after establishing that there was a duty of care. Do have a look at my video on the third and final element for a negligence claim, that the breach of duty actually caused the damage. In other words, causation. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.